Welcome to the University of Manchester's Economists Talking About series. Today we are interviewing Dr. Manuel Mosquera-Tarrío, a researcher and lecturer at the Department of Economics at the University of Manchester. Um, to start with, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and the work you do?
Yes, I'm from Argentina originally. Here I work as a lecturer and researcher. I'm teaching macroeconomics from the first year in the BSc in economics. And also I'm one of the supervisors of the Applied Economic Dissertation course. That is a course in the last year. That is also for BSc, BA, and PPE students. And then I'm researching in inflation expectations and inflation dynamics mainly.
So, you've recently done a PhD, and I was wondering if you could tell us what your main motivations for doing one was and whether you always knew you were going to do one or when you decided to.
And the main motivation, I think, or the first time that I thought about doing a PhD was during my high school. So at some point during high school. And I think the main reason is the same reason that why I choose to do economics is because I grew up in Argentina and there you face many economic shocks. It was my case. Okay, if I want to think about these issues, maybe a PhD path at some point in my life, it could be a good idea. So that was the first time, although it was not a proper decision. And then I took the decision later on during my undergraduate studies, let's say at the very end. But the first time that I thought about doing this path was during high school, let's say. And the main motivation was, observing what was going on, especially in my country and all the shocks, uh, inflation, deflation at some point, having a default crisis, have observed that unemployment grow a lot and then decrease, and at the same time observing that poverty increase but never goes back to the previous level. And all these issues behind were kind of, I think, the main motivation for both doing economics and doing a PhD later on.
So my next question kind of links to the idea of observing economics and wanting to understand it more. You have a specialism in macroeconomics, and at what stage do you think you started developing this, and why was that like the point at which you started developing a specialism?
Yeah, so I try to see economics in general as a, let's say, unit, but for the same reason that I actually entered in economics and a PhD. I think I was thinking about macroeconomic questions uh, before knowing that I was thinking in macroeconomic questions. And this idea of why, we have in the same country people doing very well and some people not doing that well. Why we experienced a default crisis when a couple of years before we were like actually doing and have kind of a good growth in the country. We experienced at the same time in my life, in a very short period of time, rate of inflation very close to European US standards, then deflation, then high increase in inflation rates. So why this happened? So, um, and all these questions are questions that are much more related to macro, let's say, than micro. So even if I try to think economics as a whole, I think that my motivation was always kind of behind. So I was always thinking about these issues. And of course, later on, when I did my master, when I did the PhD, that you have to really select what questions to study, what things to do research on. Then I basically, they are like, I properly decide to specialize in macro.
How now that you're teaching undergraduate students, how has this framed your experience of having been an undergraduate student? Has it changed the way you look at it in any way?
I think so. And a lot. And I think the main reason is because when you are, I try to see all the students as like very competent people that they might be doing the same thing that I'm doing right now in a couple of years, or maybe doing other things like being policymakers, working in the private sector in particular companies or whatever. Um, but I think that the difference between me and especially because I'm teaching first year students, is that they are start to learn the language of economics. They are start to learn how to think about big issues in economics. My role is a bit of trying to help students in connecting this complex world that we observe out there and trying to learn how to think about this world in a simplest way, in the possible and easiest, simplest way. And that's students are doing this on their own, but I'm trying to help them like constructing this. And I think this changed a lot my way of thinking about undergraduate level, right? When I was a student, I was not thinking on that on the same way, let's say. But I think this is I think this is a nice approach because it's not that we are very far away between who is the leading the class and who is actually on the other side. It's just like we are trying to respond the same type of questions, and the only difference is like, okay, I have a little bit more experience on this, and I can give you some hints of how to think about the world, and that's the only thing that I think I'm doing, and that's my role. And that's, I think, very different from my how I thought about undergraduate when I was actually a student.
Um, do you think that your research has informed your teaching at all, especially since both center around macroeconomics?
Yeah, I think so a lot. My research, and I think in general, any research that is done in macro, and I can give you an example. So one of the things that I've tried to do always is like bring examples that, probably new examples. COVID-19 crisis, the financial crisis was a couple of years ago. But also new evidence about issues that, were in the past, but now we have a better understanding of this. And that's is because we have now better research, better tools, better evidence because we have more data, for example. And all these help us to sometimes respond the same questions that 30 years ago, but in a better way. And I think that's the role of research. My research in particular, but in general, any research.
Um, Circling back to like your role as a researcher, you've worked at the Center for Latin American Monetary Studies before, right?
Yes.
How would you say that your role there differs from your current academic roles, and what did you enjoy about working there?
Okay, this role was a policy and research institution. So part of my role was doing research, but part of my role was doing policy. This is the Center for Latin American Studies. It's a hub for the central banks in Latin America. So some of the central banks in Latin America, they don't have, or they have a very small research department. So there are a group of researchers and policymakers that help all the central banks in the region to develop a new model to understand some particular issues. We organize conferences about particular topics, and we try to connect researchers and we try to connect policymakers around the region. We at some point they have a journal, so I was helping with the journal, with the publication of some articles, especially articles that were like focused on the region. And it's I mean, there is the part of research that is the same, but then the part of policy making is different because you have to apply what you know, and let's say in a very short period of time. So sometimes you have a problem and you have to solve it, and you have like 2 weeks, and that's kind of something that is very different from being on an university that the times are probably a little bit different from what you have as a policymaker, or in my case, it was not a policymaker, but helping policymakers.
And my final question is, what advice do you have for undergraduate students who are considering going into academia, and what should they do to engage with their course more?
Um, uh, to be honest, I don't really have a particular advice, and the reason why is because one thing that I learned in the academic community is that many people approach the academic community for different reasons. So I have my reasons, like it was probably very driven by my experience, but I know that there are many researchers that they have completely different experience and different approach. So if I would say something that is important is curiosity. So if you are curious about, some topics, and if you have time on whenever you have time, so give it a go. If you're curious about, I don't know, inequality, and if you have time, ask someone or get a book, read about this. and this is not gonna pay you in the short run. But I think if you at some point you're gonna do a career in the academic sector, this is gonna, it's a good investment for the medium and long term.
Thank you so much for doing this interview. It's been so interesting and so informative.
Thank you
If
for the invitation.
if you're watching this and you've enjoyed this video, remember to come back next time for our next interview.